So guys, this is chapter 11, the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, and obviously this is going to be a long chapter, so we're just going to go ahead and get into it. As you can see, section 1, quite often what ended up happening was that even families were divided by choosing sides. If you see the man to the right, General Robert E. Lee, he was actually educated at West Point, and his family owned property, which is now the Arlington Cemetery in Washington, D.C., or near it, and he went to go be the general in charge of the Confederate forces. So many officers had tough decisions to make when it came to take sides in this epic conflict. Eventually, about 1/3, 313 officers of total officers in the military resigned to join the Confederacy. This gave the South the benefit of superior military leadership. So definitely, this is one of the listings of advantages for the South. Also, sometimes family had to be divided, as you can see in the picture below, brother against brother. The Civil War divided the nation, but it also divided families. Even the First Lady, Mary Todd Lincoln, a Kentuckian, had half-brothers who fought for the Confederacy, if you can imagine. So when you're looking at the pictures of the Confederate money to the left and the statistics of resources of the Union and Confederacy, understand that financing a war for both sides in the Civil War had to act quickly in order to raise money for the war. The North had more financial advantages than the South. The South, so desperate for money, had a large case of inflation due to the insufficient money. The inflation was caused when the South printed their own money. Remember, you can't actually print money without actual finances or gold to back that up. That would just be fake money, like monopoly money. I could call monopoly money money if I wanted to, but obviously it isn't. Confederate paper money became virtually worthless due to the fact that nothing really backed the Confederate dollar. Party politics in the North, President Lincoln was dealing with division amongst his own party. Lincoln was trying to do all he could to preserve the Union, even if it meant allowing slavery to continue. Weak Southern government. Jefferson Davis faced many political problems. The Confederate states, the states' rights limited the central government's power. The commitment to this idea usually interfered with Davis's ability to conduct the war. Remember, one of the largest reasons for the war was that they felt that the states should have the right to govern themselves, yes, and keep slavery. And so when it came to this portion of the South, it was even more strict, and it was very difficult for the president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, picture to the right, to hold it together. All right, so you guys look at these pictures while I read this off. It was considered the first modern war. Unlike previous European wars, the Civil War included many civilian volunteers and two large armies that required large amounts of supplies and equipment. If you guys look over here to the right, you can see that they were trying to also use balloons for surveillance and reconnaissance during the war. Then down here, very important, the telegraph. President Lincoln stayed on top of all information that he could. He would walk across the street and get information over the telegraph, and he would also dictate battle strategies to his generals from using that new piece of equipment. The South didn't have as many people, but they still thought that they could fight on their own land, which is always important in any battle. It's just like playing a home game is always an advantage. The Union, or the North, had an Anaconda Plan, and you can see the picture of it down below, where they're going to blockade the southern ports of the Atlantic, isolate the Confederacy, and you think of an anaconda as a constricting snake. And so the concept of an Anaconda Plan is to tighten around it and then just crush it till it can't get any more oxygen or survive. So when you think of the snake, the anaconda, that's the plan of the North. Now, this is also very unique for this time. We're in section 2, and if you guys look and see, these are called ironclad boats. And it says early in the war, the Union's attack went well. However, when the Union ran into Stonewall Jackson's men, they were forced to retreat in the First Battle of Bull Run. Lincoln, who originally called for 75,000 men to serve for 3 months, upped his number to 500,000 men to serve for 3 years. The Naval War. So if you look over there, you can see the Monitor and the Merrimack, and you can see in 1861 the Union Navy started operations against the South. In 1861, President Lincoln proclaimed the blockade of all Confederate or enemy ports. By the spring of 1862, the Union Navy had sealed off every major southern harbor along the Atlantic coast, except for Charleston, South Carolina, and Wilmington, North Carolina. Lincoln wanted to put as much pressure on the South's economy as possible by cutting it off. Now, if you look at this battle right here between the Monitor and the Merrimac, and you can see the Merrimac was then captured by the CSS. That's the Confederate states have that particular boat. They hoped to break the Union blockade with a secret weapon, an iron-plated ship built by covering the hull of a wooden ship, the Merrimac, a captured Union warship with iron. The armored vessel, renamed the Virginia, could easily withstand Union cannon fire. On March 8, 1862, the Virginia sank to Union ships guarding the St. James River at Hampton Roads, Virginia. In the worst day of the war for the Union Navy, 240 soldiers died. The next day, the Union's own ironclad ship, the newly completed Monitor, challenged the Virginia. The two ships fought for hours, but neither could deliver a decisive blow. Although the vessels never fought again, the Monitor's presence kept the Virginia from breaking the northern blockade. Okay, guys, and here we go on to our next slide. And you can see, this was just interesting. I wanted to include this because this is something I had always learned about. And that is the fact that the spectators actually came out to watch the war at Manassas, or Bull Run, in 1861. And so it was just a strange concept that soldiers were being watched while people ate. I mean, you might say, yes, they brought food, so it was a picnic, but really they also had to travel about 7 hours to get there. So that might be why they brought their food. You can see down at the bottom picture, a nightmarish retreat. As an overturned wagon clogged roads, civilians and soldiers alike fled in panic. So you guys can look this up for a little bit more information. I just found it very interesting. We don't typically sit and watch battles, do we? Although that changed a little bit during the Iraq War, when they called the people watching the war on TV armchair generals. So Section 2, the early stages, the blockade. Farragut captures New Orleans, war in the West with Shiloh, and Murfreesboro. Now, a lot of this, there's so much reading, and I don't want to make this a 45-minute presentation, so you guys can see what's going on here. And you can see Farragut captures New Orleans, which if you're looking at the map down below, you can use that for information, and you can see the Union forces, the Confederate forces, who had a victory and where. And you can imagine that the mouth to the Mississippi, which is New Orleans, would be a crucial control for the Union, even though it's very deep in the South. Okay, another part of the early stages, you can see where I have a map of Virginia, and then you can see where the fort is located on a blow-up. It says McClellans Peninsula campaign. Remember, McClellan is considered the Napoleon of this particular war. He eventually runs against Lincoln in a presidential election of 1864. So McClellan's Peninsula Campaign, led by George McClellan. The goal was to seize Yorktown originally. However, when the attack took 30 days to do so, the Confederates had time to move their troops to nearby Richmond. And at Richmond, McClellan's group lost several men in what was known as the 7 Days Battle. But in all, both sides combined suffered 30,000 casualties and deaths. Okay, if you look at this map to the right, you can see which battles were actually fought outside of Virginia at the time. And you can see Antietam and Gettysburg there. If you look, the Second Battle of Bull Run and the Battle of Antietam, Second Battle of Bull Run, they met there and broke out in the Civil War near Manassas Junction. Remember, some people call it Manassas, some people will call it Bull Run. These battles each have different titles, because the South named them one thing and the North named them another thing. One would name them after rivers, another would name them after cities, just to confuse us all. So the Confederates only 20 miles from Washington, D.C. Soon after General Lee and his troops crossed into Maryland. The Battle of Antietam. The Battle of Antietam served as the South's statement to the North to accept their independence. The South also thought that a victory in the North would help them with Britain's recognition. Antietam was the bloodiest one-day battle in the war in the American history. Really, Gettysburg is the overall deadliest battle. Over 6,000 men were killed and 16,000 were wounded. Now you're looking at the Emancipation Proclamation, and you do have an assignment on this. It says on September 22nd, 1862, President Lincoln announced that he would issue the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all slaves, persons in states that were in rebellion, not the border states. Slavery in border states was not discussed because Lincoln did not want to anger at the loyalty of those particular states. It is sometimes said that the Emancipation Proclamation freed no slaves. In a way, it is true. The proclamation would only apply to Confederate states as an act to seize enemy resources. By freeing slaves in the Confederacy, Lincoln was actually freeing people he did not directly control. The way he explained the proclamation made it acceptable to much of the Union Army. He emphasized emancipation as a way to shorten. So during the war, obviously, everything has to go towards the troops. So there's a lot of shortages that happen, and none worse than food shortages, because then that makes you too lethargic to do anything else. And so what you can see here is wartime economies. The costs were extremely high during the war for everything. Both the North and the South were feeling the effects to keep their economies going. Although both were hurting financially, the South had it worse due to the high inflation and little industry. The North, unlike the South, was backed by banks and developing industry. Southern shortages and falling morale. So what's happening during this time in this area? So during this time, what we have is, especially by the end of 1862 and the beginning of 1863, there were many food shortages. And you can look at the riot picture down there to the right in Richmond, Virginia. It wasn't that the South didn't have enough food. It simply couldn't get the food where it needed to go. Remember, all of the railroads are pretty much in the North, and there's not that many railroads down in the South, and that's part of the Anaconda Plan, is to cut them off anyhow. So the Union's war boom, unlike the morale in the South, the Union experienced an economic boom. And soldiers on the front line were receiving clothes, munitions, and other necessities. Several innovations in agriculture helped minimize the loss of labor as men left to fight. So now what we have here is, of course, the group of soldiers that came into play after the Emancipation Proclamation. So it allowed for African Americans to join the military, with the news that thousands of African Americans, men, joined the Union Army. 180,000 African Americans served in the Union Army, making it roughly 9% of the total soldiers. Another 10 to 15,000 served in the Union Navy, making that about 10 to 12. Overall, it's about 10%. Approximately 180,000 African Americans, comprising 163 units, served in the Union Army during the Civil War, and many more African Americans served in the Union Navy. Both free African Americans and runaway slaves joined the fight. The most widely known battle fought by African Americans was the assault on Fort Wagner, see below, in South Carolina, by the 54th of Massachusetts. They made a movie about it. You guys can see it. It's called Glory. So you guys can see the pictures here that are also given. So if you ever have the chance to watch this movie, I highly recommend it. It's amazing, and it shows you exactly what happened with the 54th. Okay, so life during the war, you can see how interesting it is that women actually did tag along with their men as they went off to war, which doesn't typically happen now. But you can see in the picture that there were women and children in the camps, and then women worked as, nurses. And then you can see by the graph below how many people died in different ways. The soldiers in the field, Union and Confederate soldiers, faced many hardships during the war. One of the toughest issues was the fact that they were starving. When soldiers did eat food, they consumed had little to no taste due to the lack of flavor and the small portions allotted. Many soldiers would eat fruits or vegetables they seized or purchased from farms they passed. Battlefield medicine. When the soldiers were on the battlefield, many were wounded. Once the soldiers were wounded, they were exposed to many unsanitary conditions. Many surgeons used the same instruments over and over on patients, which spread multiple infections. Smallpox devastated both Union and Confederacy. The role of women in the war. Women made large contributions to the war. They stayed at home and helped managing family farms and businesses. On the battlefield, women made many contributions to the Civil War as nurses. They helped the wounded. They were cooks. They were laundresses, which means they washed clothes. Some dressed as men to serve or spy. They had jobs during this time that couldn't have before the war, which gave women really opportunities to go further. We see this again in the other World War I and World War II. Military prisons were, of course, horrible places. Early in the war, both sides would exchange prisoners of war. However, once Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation, the South refused to exchange slaves and made it clear that African Americans would be either enslaved or executed. With the South failing to exchange, Lincoln stopped all exchanging. Military prisons in both the North and the South were undersized and not a place many wanted to be. Andersonville in southwest Georgia is one of the worst camps of them all. And of course, you can go ahead and look these things up on that. Now look at this gentleman below, because he is going to be one of our presidents, and it's interesting the way the picture was taken and then colored. So look at the graph specifically, because I do want you to see how many people died at each war, especially Gettysburg, the deadliest battle we've ever fought. The Union planned to gain control of the Mississippi River and had already started the process when New Orleans was captured. Remember, Farragut did that, the delta of the Mississippi River anyway. The North continued to win battles. If they could capture Vicksburg, they could cut the South in two. Garrison's raid. Ordered by Ulysses S. Grant, Benjamin Garrison took 1,700 troops on a cavalry raid in Mississippi. Garrison's troops went 600 miles in 2 weeks, tearing up railroads, burning depots, and fighting skirmishes. His raid was a success, as Grant's men were able to move the south of the city. And then the siege at Vicksburg. And you can see the battle there, 19,000 people dying. After two previous assaults were launched in Vicksburg in May of 1863, Grant decided the only way to take the city was to put it under siege. This meant that Grant and his men intended to cut off food supplies and bombard the city until its defenders gave up. On July 4th, poetic, 1863, the Confederate commander of Vicksburg surrendered. The Union had finally split the Confederacy in two. And where does that lead us to? Well, most famously of all, it leads us to Gettysburg. And so you can kind of see all these pictures around it and some of the people involved. You see a picture of McClellan there, and Ambrose Burnside, and then Joseph Hooker, and you can read that little area right there that talks about Hooker. The road to Gettysburg, Lincoln was upset by his general McClellan, who allowed Lee to escape and recover after Antietam. Lincoln got rid of him and appointed Burnside as his replacement. That's why the arrow goes down. Then at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, 1 month later, Burnside attacked Lee in Fredericksburg, Virginia. 12,000 Union troops died, so Lincoln fired Burnside and replaced him with General Joseph Hooker. The Battle of Gettysburg then. After General Lee had weakened the Union Army, he decided to march on Pennsylvania, very far up into the north, of course. In Pennsylvania, Lee and his men seized livestock, food, and clothing. General George Meade, the general who actually wins Gettysburg, was placed in command of the Union Army, and you see his picture there to the right, and could force the Confederacy out. On July 2nd, Lee attacked at Gettysburg. 15,000 men under the control of General George E. Pickett and General A.P. Hill tried to make a massive attack. The attack is known as Pickett's Charge. Inflicted 7,000 casualties just at that moment. In less than a half an hour, when the Union troops held their ground and bombarded the Confederacy with cannon fire. The aftermath of the battle. At Gettysburg, the Union suffered 23,000 casualties, but the South lost an estimated 28,000 casualties, over one-third of Lee's entire force. Gettysburg proved to be the turning point in the war and a Union victory. And of course, this leads to the Gettysburg Address, which is so amazingly famous because obviously Lincoln goes and, bodies were rotting out in the field and they needed to bury them because apparently they say that the smell of these rotting bodies was horrifying. And so you can see this is supposed to be a picture at the top in black and white of Lincoln at Gettysburg. Very difficult to take pictures back then. Down below is a digital interpretation of what he may have looked like. And then to the right is one of his Gettysburg addresses. He did rewrite it a couple of times and kind of made it to the people that he was sending the copy of the Gettysburg Address to. But I suggest that you download that and read it. Very, very short. Apparently another man spoke for an hour or more. And okay, guys, so here we are at one of the other parts of the turning point. Look at the picture to the right, and you can see everything in blue that is that is Union, and red is Confederate. And we're talking about Tennessee. So the Union wanted to capture Chattanooga, in order to control a major railroad running south to Atlanta, Georgia. Union General Rosecrans forced the Confederates to evacuate Chattanooga. General Bragg forced the Union to retreat back to Chattanooga, but Bragg's forces attacked the Union at Chickamauga Creek. Lincoln made Grant the overall commander, and he's the guy a little while ago I showed you a picture of. He will eventually become our president. Grant took charge and defeated the Confederates at Lookout Mountain. Then Grant ordered Sherman to attack the Confederates north of Missionary Ridge. Sherman's going to be playing another big role in this war as he does his march to the ocean, to the Atlantic. Grant was made chief of the Union forces for his important victory at Vicksburg and Chattanooga. Now, something unique that happened to us is that our state becomes a part of the Union. And I wanted you guys to see this because the two states that come into the Union are West Virginia and Nevada during the war. You can see that 1863 was West Virginia and 1864 was us. And for different reasons, Virginia, the west part of Virginia, as a big state, they felt that they were not the rich land-owning people that needed slavery, that they were farmers and people that worked in the mountains. And then for us, well, they just kind of needed our silver and our votes. So that's why we're called Battleborn. And then you can see Mountaineers are always free is their motto. And you can hear how those things play into them both becoming states. Right here, this is Section 5. This is a big chapter. So in Section 5, the war does end. It eventually ends up being Grant versus Lee. From the wilderness of Cold Harbor, the first battle of Grant's campaign erupted in the wilderness, a densely forested area near Fredericksburg, Virginia. Despite heavy losses, Grant continued to push forward. Grant headed toward Spotsylvania. Unable to break Lee's lines at Spotsylvania, Grant headed toward Cold Harbor. Grant's plan backfired. Grant lost 7,000 men compared to only 1,500 for the South. And then the siege at Petersburg. Upon the similar to the Union's plan at Vicksburg, Grant ordered General Philip Sheridan to stage a cavalry raid north and west of Richmond. However, with the plans to capture Petersburg, they had to pause. The city was defended by miles of barricades. Realizing that a full-scale frontal assault would be suicide, Grant ordered to put the city under siege. Heard that before. Throughout the war, the Union had many large victories in the South. Cities like Vicksburg, New Orleans, and Atlanta really helped the Union win the war. Events like Farragut's attack on Mobile, Alabama, helped the North as well. Although the North never captured Mobile, the Union was able to seal off the bay. The South never regained access to any ports in the Gulf of Mexico. You guys can see a couple pictures down there too. So right here, look at this. This is me trying to make this very visual for you guys. And you can see these two Farragut attacks Mobile, as we discussed a second ago, and then the fall of Atlanta. And you guys can see when those things happen by using the pictures up there. And you can see who is in charge, commanders and leaders. And you can see exactly the casualties, the strength, all of those types of things that are there. Now, the final bit that you should pay attention to is this gentleman to the right, General Sherman. Sherman began his march with 62,000 men to the port of Savannah, Georgia, living off the land and, by his own estimate, more than $1 million in property damage. That's what he caused as he did this march. Sherman called this harsh tactic material war or hard war, often seen as a species of total war. At the end of this campaign, known as Sherman's March to the Sea, his troops captured Savannah on December 21st, 1865. Sherman then dispatched the famous message to Lincoln offering him the city as a Christmas present. And this is the last slide with any real information on it today. And what we have here is the South surrendering. First, we have to re-elect Abe Lincoln, though. And so we have the Democrats nominated George McClellan. We talked about him before. He was fired by Abraham Lincoln earlier in the war and replaced by Burnside. Promised to stop the hostilities and open negotiations with the South and restore the Union peaceably. However, with the North capturing Atlanta, morale lifted in the North, and Lincoln was easily able to win the re-election with 55% of the popular vote. Lincoln viewed his election as an opportunity to end slavery permanently. On January 31st, 1865, the 13th Amendment was added to the Constitution, outlawing slavery in the United States. The surrender, with things getting ugly for the Confederacy, in Virginia, Lee was forced to retreat westward. However, General Philip Sheridan's men cut Lee off at Appomattox Courthouse. When Lee's troops failed to break through the enemy lines, Lee had no choice but to surrender on, yes, my birthday. General Lee, not 1865, of course, General Lee surrendered on the steps of the Appomattox Courthouse. The terms of the surrender were done kindly. Remember, these are our people. These are not our enemy. It was like a family fight, and nobody wanted this to be so that when you're sitting over a meal later on, you still hated each other. We tried to clean this up as best we could. So General Grant was thanked by Lee for being kind and said Grant's kindness would do much towards the conciliating of our people. Lincoln's assassination only 5 days later. While attending the play with his wife, and you can see this down below, he, of course, was killed by John Wilkes Booth. And what I also want you to look at is the statistics I have down there. It says 643,945 people were killed in all of the other wars combined. And, of course, none of this is ever exact, but it's close. And then just in the Civil War alone, 620,000. So that's why they call it the deadliest war, because we are ourselves fighting ourselves. And then if you watch the video that I've given you, you see that with the increase in technology, that kind of killed people faster as well. All right, and then the final slide is, of course, the last picture taken by Lincoln. Here he is, and this is just February before he died in April.